anticipated, the process he unleashed did indeed threaten the future existence of life on this planet. Even pugnacious Winston Churchill had moral qualms. When he visited Truman towards the end of his presidency, Margaret, the president's daughter, described the scene.
Everyone was in an ebullient mood, especially Dad. Without warning, Mr. Churchill turned to him and said,
Mr. President, I hope you have your answer ready for that hour when you and I stand before St. Peter and he says, I understand you too are responsible for putting off those atomic bombs. What have you got to say for yourselves?
Although Harry Truman left office with approval ratings so low that only George W. Bush has come close since, he is now widely viewed as a near great president and routinely showered with praise by Republicans and Democrats alike. Former National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, who George Bush credited with telling me everything I know about the Soviet Union, named Truman her Man of the Century to Time magazine. David McCullough's 1993 biography of Truman won him a wide readership and a Pulitzer Prize, followed by an Emmy Award at Best TV Movie on the cable network HBO in 1995, seen by many of us.
First bomb will be ready by the end of the first week in August. The Japs know they're licked. Why won't they quit? Well, their strategy is to prolong the war, no matter what the cost, till we agree to let the Emperor stay on the throne. They'll prolong it by any means necessary. They just will not surrender. Some of the scientists who developed the bomb believe that it should never be used.
Is that so? Well, what the hell do they think we built it for? We can't uninvent it, Henry. What about the idea of setting one off for the Japs to see? What happened to that idea?
Mr. President, I can only speak to the military question. We must use overwhelming force to crush the Japanese army. Destroy their will to make war.
In the myth the film creates, Henry Stimson and General George Marshall are portrayed as looking down on the underdog little man Truman, who is following his moral conscience. But their real positions on the bomb and Japan are misrepresented.
With regular weapons, the firebombing of Dresden killed 30,000 in one night. Tokyo is utterly gone. With almost everyone in it. They figure 100,000 dead there. Seems to me, if there is a moral point of no return, you've long since passed it. If I don't drop the bomb, so many more of our young men will die in the invasion of Japan. They're men too, and women and children. How could I face the people when it's finally over and say that I had the power to possibly end the war long ago? Spare the lives of their loved ones, and I chose not to use it.
In the film, the Soviet point of view is entirely ignored, and the characters of Henry Wallace and Jimmy Burns are not included. But the real Harry Truman is far darker than McCullough's heroic underdog. Despite his denials, his flawed and tragic decision to use the bomb against Japan was meant instead as a ruthless and deeply unnecessary warning that the United States could be unrestrained by humanitarian considerations in using these same bombs against the Soviet Union if they continued to interfere in Europe or Asia. However, on a larger moral scale, Truman knew he was beginning a process that could end life on the planet, as he said explicitly on at least 3 occasions. Yet he forged ahead recklessly. Unnecessarily killing people is a war crime. Threatening human extinction goes far, far beyond that. This is what Henry Wallace understood more deeply than any other government official. The man who did his utmost to end the U.S. monopoly of the atomic bomb has been largely lost to history.
Henry Wallace, U.S. Secretary of Commerce, is called to the White House by President Truman. He had advocated publicly a more conciliatory attitude towards Russia. Faced with public criticism of American official policy on world affairs by a member of his own cabinet, the President asked for and accepted Wallace's resignation.
Dear Harry, as you requested, here is my resignation. I shall continue to fight for peace. I am sure that you approve and will join me in that great endeavor.
His walking papers in the outgoing mail. Last official act of the one remaining cabinet member appointed in Roosevelt's first administration. That's that. And so Mr. Wallace takes a walk after 13 years in government posts, from cabinet seat to park bench. He's going to renew those attacks on Secretary Burns' policies in Paris. But right now, the man who predicted 60 million jobs in America seems to be busy reading the help wanted ad.
After leaving government in 1946, he ran for president in 1948 as a candidate for the newly formed Progressive Party. Their message of peace in a time of rising tensions was not heard. Repeatedly attacked by Truman and the press as a communist sympathizer, Wallace garnered less than 3% of the vote. Following the election, he retired from politics, increasingly accused of sheltering communists. During his campaign, he compromised himself during the pressures of the Korean War and the McCarthy period, loudly condemning the Soviets. But he clung to his progressive ideals and decried later U.S. involvement in Vietnam. He lived quietly on his... What might this country have become had Wallace succeeded Roosevelt in April of '45 instead of Truman? Would no atomic bombs have been used in World War II? Could we have avoided the nuclear arms race and the Cold War? Would civil rights and women's rights have triumphed in the immediate post-war years? Might colonialism have ended decades earlier and the fruits of science and industry been spread more equitably around the globe? We'll never know.
Some have spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering, century which will come out of this war, can be and must be the century of the common man. If we really believe we are fighting for a people's peace, all the rest becomes easy.
Different vision.
The only way to defeat communism in the world is to do a better and smoother job of production and distribution. Let's make it a clean race, a determined race, but above all, a peaceful race in the service of humanity. The source of all our mistakes is fear. Russia fears Anglo-Saxon encirclement. We fear communist penetration. Out of fear, great nations have been acting like cornered beasts, thinking only of survival. Common people of the world will not tolerate imperialism, even under enlightened Anglo-Saxon atomic bomb auspices. The destiny of the English-speaking people is to serve the world, not dominate it.
Following Churchill's speech, conditions deteriorated rapidly. When Soviet troops stayed in northern Iran beyond their March deadline, Truman threatened war. He wrote,
If the Russians were to control Iran's oil, either directly or indirectly, it would be a serious loss for the economy of the Western world.
Truman later privately claimed to a hardline senator that he gave the Soviets a nuclear warning, telling their ambassador, if Soviet troops are not out in 48 hours, we're going to drop it on you. They were out, he claimed, in 24. The Soviets did withdraw, but probably for reasons other than atomic blackmail. Less than 2 months later, the U.S. cut off desperately needed reparation payments from West Germany to the Soviet Union. And in July of '46, sending another chilling message about its intentions, the U.S. decided to proceed with an atomic bomb test in the Marshall Islands. In September '46, in front of 20,000 people at New York's Madison Square Garden, Henry Wallace tried to put a stop to the growing madness.
The tougher we get, the tougher the Russians will get. We can get cooperation once Russia understands that our primary objective
American world will gradually become more alike. The Russians will be forced to grant more and more of the personal freedoms, and we shall become more and more absorbed with the problems of social economic justice.
The speech became world news, deeply embarrassing to Secretary of State Jimmy Burns, who told Truman either he or Wallace had to go. Support for Wallace poured in throughout the ensuing controversy from such as Eleanor Roosevelt and Albert Einstein, but not from the Truman administration. James Forrestal regarded Wallace as at best a security risk, and secretly had his Naval Intelligence Unit monitoring the Secretary of Commerce, and shared information with the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover, who harbored deep suspicions about Wallace's loyalties. Wallace in turn considered Hoover an American Himmler. Truman later denied he had read and approved the entire speech in advance, which he had. He wrote in his diary,
Wallace is a pacifist 100%. He wants us to disband our armed forces, give Russia our atomic secrets, and trust a bunch of adventurers in the Kremlin Politburo. I do not understand a dreamer like that.
Truman fired Wallace, and with his departure, the best chance to avert a nuclear arms race was gone. 1947 would be the turning point as the U.S. plunged headlong into the Cold War at home and abroad. Behind the ongoing liberation movements in places such as British Malaya, French Indochina, and Dutch Indonesia, U.S. leadership painted a dire picture of Stalin spreading world revolution, ruling out negotiations and ignoring any grays in its black and white conclusions. In Greece, the British Army toppled the popular leftist National Liberation Front and restored the monarchy and right-wing dictatorship, sparking a communist-led uprising. In the public's mind, the Soviet Union remained at the center of a communist conspiracy to dominate the world. Truman, who was willing to approve the use of atomic weapons, wrote in September, "We are very close to war." France had little enthusiasm for this U.S. initiative, fearing a remilitarized Germany. Nor did Britain, but the U.S. gambled that its atomic monopoly would win out, rejecting Soviet attempts to compromise until it achieved both a basic law outlining a West German state and the creation in April of 1949 of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This, for the first time in its history, committed the United States to a peacetime military alliance with Western Europe. Came the first of three major events, none of them unforeseen by the laws of cause and effect. Truman shocked the nation.
We have evidence that within recent weeks an atomic explosion occurred in the USSR.
In 1948, Oppenheimer had said, "Our atomic monopoly is like a cake of ice melting in the sun." As Henry Wallace had warned in 1945, Truman and his group were terribly wrong to assume that U.S. would have an ongoing monopoly on the bomb. Americans felt more vulnerable than ever, and the nuclear arms race that Wallace and the scientists had so feared now escalated as the U.S. hastened development of a hydrogen bomb. As 1949 ended, the world's largest and most populous nation, China, turned communist. When Mao Zedong routed the corrupt nationalist forces of Jiang Jieshi, who was unquestionably the most important revolution since Russia's 1917 overthrow of the Tsar. Time